Hi, everybody. Welcome to this short session, 30 minutes. Tim Baker's my name. And what I want to talk about this morning is what are the three key elements of high-performing teams. So if we could distill it down to three key elements, what are they? And I am going to share this information with you based on some reputable research. And the research was conducted looking at high-performing teams, basically in the private sector. And what is very obvious is that these three elements are critically important to any team success. So if you can embrace these three in your own team, then it's likely not only that you would be classified as a high-performing team, but it's likely that your productivity would go up as well. And that was another interesting piece of the research. So let's get underway. I will be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this presentation. So no need to take notes. It's short, it's sharp, it's straight to the point. So let's get going and go straight to my slides. Okay, those of you who don't know me, Tim Baker, as I mentioned, is my name. You can see that I'm an author. I've written 16 books. I deliver keynote addresses, I run workshops, and I play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition in Brisbane. Now, the information I'm sharing with you today is pretty much coming from my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. And I just want to talk a little bit about that before I get underway. And then, of course, I'll share with you these three key elements. So just a couple of testimonials have been written. You can see that there's a sporting flavour to the book. I actually went and interviewed a number of All Blacks for this particular book. And what I wanted to find out is why do they have an 80% success rate? So 80% of the times that they run out on the field, they win, which I believe is the most successful sporting team in the world, male or female. And you can see there's a couple of Wallaby legends and All Black legends, including the Commissioner of Queensland Police, Katarina Carroll, as well, have written some nice comments about the book. Nick Farr-Jones, who was the captain of the Wallabies team in Australia, also wrote a nice testimonial about the book as well. So whilst it draws upon the sporting, the whole notion of sport, many of these lessons are actually very transferable to the world of work. So one of the objections that people might have when we address the topic of the three characteristics of high-performing teams is, is it even possible for a high-performing team to be to work in the world of work? I don't doubt for a minute that many of you have been members of high-performing teams, or may be also. It's not common. Most teams are mediocre in my experience, but I think it is very possible to develop a high-performing team. But I would suggest to you that the place to start is actually on the relationship dimension of teamwork and not the task dimension. So let's have a look at what I mean by that. But before I do that, I'm going to cover basically three key concepts this morning: task versus relationship. The task, of course, is what the team does, it's usually the product or the service that it provides. The relationship is how the team members themselves interact with each other. I'm going to talk obviously about the three key elements and give you some sense of what they are, how they can be applied. And at the end of this presentation, I have a special offer for you for attending. So let's look at this concept of task and relationship. Now, if you look at teamwork per se, obviously a team is there because they have a task to do. They probably have lots of tasks to do, but ultimately it's probably a service that they're providing or a product that they're delivering. So the team has that purpose. Now, can you be a high-performing team by just focusing on the task? Well, not necessarily, because the other dimension, which is the relationship dimension, is critically important to any team success, as you'll see this morning. And the relationship dimension actually separates a high-performing team from a mediocre team. So the secret sauce, if there is such a thing, is not so much to work only on the task, but to work on the relationships between the team leader and the team members, where that's where you come involved, of course, and also the relationships between team members. This is the area that will separate a high performing from a mediocre team. So let's just talk about that for a moment before we launch into the three elements. The first thing, as you can see up the top there, is you've got the task. Now, the task obviously is what you do. Now, I don't want to go there because you're the expert in that area. But if your relationship dimension is unhealthy, it's likely that it's going to impact on the task. Now, let's be honest, most of the problems and misunderstandings and concerns that happen in teamwork are usually because of relationships. They're not because of the task. Obviously, they impact on the task, but it's more around the relationship. So there's two subsets of that. There's obviously the need for you as a team leader to cater to the individual needs and interests and motivations of the team members. As we all know, people are different in their motivations. Some people need a cuddle, some people don't. Some people need to be told what to do. Some people need to be encouraged. We all know that. And that, of course, is a critically important part of leadership. It's not easy, we know that, but obviously it's a critically important part of teams. But it's not the only part of the relationship dimension, because the other side of it, of course, is all the while you've got to maintain a harmonious, balanced, and collaborative team. And this is really how people themselves contribute. And this is another dimension or another subset of, of the relationship dimension. Now, there are numerous models out there, of course, on what that might look like. And one of my favorite is Blake's model here, which you can see that it's a typical 2x2 matrix. And you can see that on the left-hand side, on the vertical axis, you've got concern for people. And of course, the higher up, the more concern for people, and the lower, the less concern for people. And across the horizontal there, you've got concern for production. So you could substitute the word production for task and substitute the word people for relationships. And basically what Blake is saying in his model is that a leader can adopt 5 positions in teams. So let's look at the impoverished position. You'll notice there it's in the bottom left-hand corner. So in the impoverished position, it's low on task and low on people. And this is what we might call the reluctant leader. This is the leader who has been thrust into a leadership role. They don't want to be there. And frankly, they're there in name only. Now, we would suggest that that's not a great place to be. Now, if you move across to the right-hand side on the bottom right-hand quadrant, you'll notice that there is the task dimension. And in the task dimension, it's high on getting the task done, but by the same token, it's low on the concern for people. So this is the task master. This is the person that pushes the need for high productivity. They're very insistent on KPIs being met and so forth. Now, there's a time and a place for that, obviously. But of course, if that's the only kind of approach that a leader uses, they're likely to be in some strife in terms of building a high-performing team. Now, moving anti-clockwise, in the top right-hand corner, we've got team management. Now, at first glance, you look at that and you say, well, surely that would be the best place to be because it's high on production and high on people. So wouldn't that be the ideal approach? And I would say to you, not necessarily. I think that it depends on the circumstances you're in. In other words, it depends on the context. But I think if you were given an opportunity to choose between those 4, I'd probably say that that's the place to be. But I'll explain that a bit further in a moment. And then coming around to the top left-hand corner, you've got the country club style of leadership. And the country club style of leadership, according to Blake, is a high concern for people, but a low concern for production. So I'm not a member of a country club. You may be, but I'm not. I would assume in a country club there's a lot of discussions and business and relationship building that's done. But perhaps really at the end of the day, not much might occur, certainly not in the country club itself. It might lead to other business. Now, a country club leader will cultivate a team where people actually enjoy coming to work. They enjoy the camaraderie, they enjoy the esprit de corps with the people that they work with, but quite frankly, nothing much gets done. So believe it or not, there is a time and place for that. And you'll notice right in the middle, you've got the middle of the road approach. And what I'm suggesting here is that the leader can fluctuate between the various quadrants depending on the circumstances they're in. So in a situation where you've got low morale, of course, country club leadership approach might be the right thing to adopt at that time. When we have to meet deadlines and really, or there's some sort of a crisis or an emergency, the task leadership approach, bottom right-hand corner, might be the ideal approach. And if you've got a team of absolute guns who are really very, very good at what they do, there might be cause to have impoverished leadership in the sense that really the leader's not adding any value by getting involved in the tasks that people do. And the team management approach might be a general approach that people can use in those circumstances. So I'm just sharing with you this dimension of task and relationship. And as I said at the beginning of this, really it's the relationship dimension that makes all the difference. And that's certainly what the research tells us. So let's have a look at the research. Now, the research that I have looked at here is Sandy Pentland's research from MIT. Now, Sandy Pentland was a technical guy, or is a technical guy, and what he did is he created these little lapel gadgets that people would wear on their lapel, and he asked them to wear it for 6 weeks. And during that time, these little lapel gadgets could actually track the type of interactions that team members had. So he mic'd up a group of people or a team of people that were in high performance. So he classified teams according to 3 criteria: high performance, low performance, and in the middle, mediocre performance. And that was based on their success in terms of their productivity. And what he found was something interesting after 6 months. So let's actually share what that was. So what he found, first of all, in a very broad sense, is he found and confirmed that communication is critical to team success. And I don't think you needed to be here with me this morning to understand that, but ultimately he proved that that was the case. So communication is critical. So obviously communication is part of the relationship dimension of teamwork. Secondly, he noticed, more importantly, that it was the communication patterns more than the message that made the difference. So this was about who talked to whom about what, not so much about what, but who talked to whom. So with these maps, he could actually track the types of interactions that were going on between team members. And he found that in the high-performing teams, the actual maps were a lot more coherent and people were communicating with each other more readily, whereas in the low-performing teams, there were 1 or 2 dominant people in the team who kind of made all the decisions and were the go-to people. So he was able to demonstrate that high-performing teams, all team members interacted with each other. He also found that actually it wasn't in the meetings themselves where this was very evident, but it was in the corridors. And of course, this was pre-COVID, but when people were in the workplace, it was the corridor conversations that people had that made all the difference. And he found the informal settings, in fact, really was a very good yardstick for determining the patterns of communication, because obviously it was spontaneous in many respects, and who talked to whom in those corridors. And of course, this little gadget on the lapel was able to be able to monitor that. He also found that at the end of the day, the best predictors of productivity were two concepts he came up, which were energy and engagement. Now, they're two of the three elements, and I'm going to define what I mean by that, but energy and engagement were the critically important determinants of team success. That is, these are part of the elements of the relationship dimension of teams. And in fact, he actually found even more so that energy engagement accounted for a third of the variation in dollar terms of team productivity. As I said, this was in a private sector, a series of private sector companies. So he could actually track, communication patterns and the actual outcome in terms of the sort of end of the year review of the performance of that team. And he found that significantly a third of the variation came from two elements, which is energy and engagement. So obviously we need to tune in to what that is, because that's critical to team success. It does raise a very interesting question, and we've all heard of the concept of the chicken and the egg. What comes first? Is it the chicken or is it the egg? And it's a paradox, isn't it? And I think it could also be a paradox when you consider high-performing teams and ask yourself the question, does a high-performing team go out of their way to promote better communication between team members, or does better communication build high performance? What comes first? And, if I looked at a high-performance team, is it because they communicate better, or is it because a team has worked very hard on the communication that they have, in fact, produced a high-performing team? Probably a bit of both, the truth be known. And I think it's what is interesting about Pentland's research is that it seems, I guess, almost absurd that how we communicate could be so much more important to success than what we communicate. So it's really the patterns of communication that make all the difference in a successful team. And so he was able to map these, of course, and he could see that, for example, if we had 6 people in the team, that each of those 6 people over the course of 6 weeks would informally spend lots of time communicating with each other about a range of topics. The range of topics wasn't as important as the fact that each of them were willing to communicate with each other on a regular basis. And that is the key to success. Now, obviously, how do you get people to do that? Well, obviously, trust level is critically important, isn't it? Because if people have a good trust level and rapport with each other, they're likely to spend time talking to each other in an informal setting than they would otherwise. So let's just kind of sum this up and have a look at what the 5 key communication factors are in team achievement. And let's understand what we might be able to do in their own teams in order to be able to implement some of this. So the first important factor in this is that everybody in the high-performing teams contributes equally, not only in the meetings, but also in the casual conversations. In other words, 1 or 2 people don't monopolise the conversations. Now, you can do something about this at a team meeting, of course, and making sure that 1 or 2 people don't completely dominate the conversation. Now, whilst those 1 or 2 people might have something very valuable to say, and we should be mindful of that, the reality is if you've got a couple of people who dominate a team meeting, it's likely that another couple of people would be happy to take a back seat and allow these 2 people to dominate because they don't think it's worth saying anything. Now, in those circumstances, that's not a healthy format. So I think in the team meeting, you've got to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to say something. Not everyone might say something, and to make sure that we don't have 1 or 2 people dominating the meeting. I think if you can start to do that in the team meetings, you'll find that your impromptu meetings will follow suit. The second key point is that the most meaningful conversations, and certainly this is what Pentland found, because these meetings still met online at different times. What he found is when they met face to face, this created vibrance and energy. So vibrance and energy were created. And energy, as you know, is one of the key elements of a high-performing team. And so obviously in our hybrid working environment, it's not always possible to meet face-to-face. However, wherever you can meet face-to-face, I'd be highly recommending you do so that you can boost that energy level and that vibrance in your team. The third element that he found, and this was very interesting, he found that high-performing teams were not reliant on their team leader as much as the low-performing team. In other words, people in the high-performing teams could often make decisions without checking with their leader. Now, of course, they would, out of courtesy, let their team leader know what was discussed and what the outcomes of those decisions were. And of course, the leader could always veto those decisions. But it was found that in the high-performing teams, people were prepared to talk to their team leader only after they'd come up with some solutions internally anyway. So that was another hallmark of a high-performing team, that they'd go out of their way to look after and take responsibility for some of the decisions that needed to be made in the team context. And of course, you as a leader have to be very careful with this, because if every time someone comes to you with a problem and you respond to it, even if the response is the right response, what you are in effect doing is making that person or persons dependent or reliant on you. And of course, if they're dependent and reliant on you, they're going to come back again and again to ask you questions and to seek out your feedback. So the key point for you is not to respond to the question. And I guess the point is to help them help themselves. And there's a difference between helping people and helping people help themselves. And leaders are in the business of helping people help themselves. They're not in the business of helping people. I'd like you to just think about that for a moment. And what that means is, I guess there's an old adage, it's better to help people catch a fish or teach people to catch a fish than to catch the fish for them. And I think that rings true for a lot of leaders that I work with, of course. Number 4 on the list. What Pentland found from his research is that the high-performing teams, as I mentioned earlier, have more one-on-one conversations with each other than usual. So I would be encouraging team members to talk to each other informally and to come up with resolutions. So, for example, if there's a shift roster or something, instead of you sorting that out, why don't you get your team members to do that? Or if there's a problem of, between 2 team members, why not get them to sort it out? I mean, obviously, you come in and sort it out if you need to, but at least give the team members the first opportunity to do that. I think that's a sensible thing to do. And finally, and this is, of course, so we've got energy engagement, and the third element that I haven't touched on yet is exploration. What I mean by exploration is that what Pentland found is that people in high-performing teams were willing to network beyond their team. What that means, of course, is any team is not in isolation, is it? But your team relies on a whole bunch of stakeholders to give you information, to provide you with resources, to do lots of things to help you achieve what you need to do. So what Pentland found was that in the high-performing teams, the team members went out of their way to actually engage with stakeholders and not make the assumption that it was the team leader's job to do that. Whereas what he found with the low-performing teams was that the low-performing teams would actually be reliant on the leader to do that. So there you have it. There are the 5 key factors. So energy, summing up, is defined as the frequency and value of communications between team members. Engagement is the distribution of energy amongst team members. And as I said earlier, there's no substitute for face-to-face conversations. And exploration, which I've just covered, is really about communicating beyond the team environment, that everybody in the team has a stake, if you like, in stakeholder management. And that becomes a pretty important point there. All right, so if you'd like a copy of my book, there it is. Sorry, I've got the wrong slide there. So if you'd like a copy of my book, but before you do that, you might like to attend next week. I have one of these every Friday at 10 a.m. You're more than welcome to attend next week. We talk about the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams, and I'm going to share those with you next week in a short, sharp session. You can see you've got the link there. So when you get the slides today, you'll be able to register as you did for today, and you're in. And finally, as I mentioned before, if you're interested and you'd like a copy of my book, you are more than welcome to take a copy, and you will get that for $25 inclusive of postage. Whereas if you look on Amazon, it's available for about $35. So if you'd like to buy a copy of the book, let me know, and I will sign it for you and send it out to you with an invoice, and away you go. So folks, I'll stop sharing for a moment so I can talk directly to you. Thanks everyone. I hope you found that useful. I hope it's confirmed some things you've already known. And if you're looking at developing a high-performing teams, the 3 key elements are energy, engagement, and exploration. So thank you, everyone. Look forward to catching you next Friday. And as I said, if you'd like a copy of the book, let me know. All the best, everyone. Have a wonderful weekend, and hopefully we'll see you next Friday. Thank you and goodbye.